My name's David Lorimer. I'm the program director of the Scientific and Medical Network, and I'm doing a series of interviews with some of our honorary members. And today I'm with Professor Stuart Kauffman, who's in his summer home off the coast of Vancouver. And he's joining us to talk about his life and work. Welcome, Stuart. Very nice to see you.
Well, thank you, and I'm glad to know that you're in such a lovely spot in the southwest of France.
Indeed. So my first question is, who and or what inspired you in your line of work? Because you've been through quite a number of different transitions, I think, philosophy, and then I think some medicine, and then all your work in biology and complexities. That might not be too easy a question to answer.
Well, there's a number of them. So I guess my heroes are Phil Anderson, Nobel laureate in physics, and Hal Waddington in biology. Wadd was just amazing, and I met him, a long time ago. And I didn't meet, but Jacobin Monod with a lactose operon figured me on my first adventure, which I can tell you about briefly. I was at Oxford learning to speak in the subjunctive. If you're an English Oxonian philosopher, you must speak in the subjunctive, and never clearly. In any case, I came back and I had done work also in neural networks. Receptor fields were just being discovered. I was on my way to medical school, and I took a course in embryology, and I cut the canonical flatworm in half, and each half regenerated exactly like they were supposed to. If you've never seen it, David, it's astonishing. You cut this thing in half, and 2 days later, there's 2 worms. And if it just doesn't blow your mind, you don't have a mind. Well, let me just state the big problem at that time. We knew what the genes were. We were sort of working out the code. We thought that every cell had the same set of genes, but different cells made different proteins, and nobody knew how that could happen. So Jacobin Monod solved it with the discovery in 1961 of the lactose operon, where one gene makes a protein that binds next to another gene and turns it off. And then 2 years later, in 1963, they have published a paper saying, I got 2 genes, A and B. A represses B, and B represses A. They could have 2 steady states, A on, B off, B on, A off. So the same genes could have a different expression pattern. So I literally read that with good fortune the year I came back from Oxford. I thought, oh my God, there must be a huge network of genes turning one another on and off. So I'll just say this briefly. My first adventure was an odd one. Obviously, there's going to be some big network. I asked a very funny question. Is there a class of networks of genes turning one another on and off that just generically behaves with sufficient order that it could explain ontogeny? It's a weird question to ask. So how would you do that? Well, you have to invent a class of networks, and then you have to study them. So I knew about light bulbs and Boolean functions, but not differential equations. So I invented random Boolean nets. And briefly, it's just 1,000 light bulbs. Every light bulb has inputs from some light bulbs, and every light bulb has a rule saying how it turns on or off depending what the light bulbs are doing. And so that's this enormous class of Boolean nets. And I stumbled into criticality. I made networks with a large number of light bulbs, N, where everybody had 2 inputs and some logical rule about turning on and off depending upon their inputs, like and or not. David, it turned out that they were critical. It just blew my mind. It has enormous localization in phase space. And over the next 30 years, it's turned out that genetic regulatory nets are really critical, and brain is too. So that's been a whole long adventure. And it was because of that. Actually, I met Brian Goodwin, in part due to that. That's a fun story too. I was in medical school making little models of Boolean nets. And I didn't know anybody. And I thought, who might be interested? There's a man named Warren McCulloch, who was one of the inventors of cybernetics. I'm a third-year medical student at the University of California in San Francisco, and I thought, maybe if I can write Warren, there's this thing you can do in your junior year. You could go do a medical something. So I thought maybe I could, go to MIT. So I wrote Warren my results, and I got a letter back, David. Here I am, okay. And the letter says, Kauffman, all Cambridge excited about your results. I thought,
That's great.
I later learned it's Warren's style of writing. Anyway, he was wonderful, and my young wife and I went, and we lived for 3 months with Warren. Well, Warren had earlier visitors, Jack Cowan and his wife Jill, later my first chairman, and Brian Goodwin. So I met Brian, I guess. Brian was in his early 30s and I was in my late 20s. In the most wonderful sense, I think I fell in love with Brian, the human, within 15 minutes of meeting him. And we have been dear friends for the rest of our lives. He died several years ago. Brian was at Schumacher, and Brian was always 20 years ahead of everybody, including me, 10 to 20 years, and he was always right, including the science of qualities. And what an amazing guy.
Yes,
So,
indeed. And then tell us a bit about Hal Waddington, because he's another great character, isn't he?
oh, he's just wonderful. So because of Brian and Jack, Waddington was running conferences on towards the theoretical biology. And so I was invited to the third and then the fourth one. So Waddington was just wonderful. He wrote me and he said, do you have any of those painting mitts that you could bring from San Francisco? So I did. He was lovely. Waddington, if you go back to Darwin, there's two pathways forward. One is Darwin, then the discovery of a blending inheritance. So Darwinism is not going to work. There's not going to be any heritable variation. Then the rediscovery of Mendel in the year 1900, and therefore inheritance won't blend because there's these little atoms of inheritance. And then the invention of population genetics that rescued Darwin by Haldane, Fisher, and Wright in the 1920s. But for their purposes, the organism didn't matter, just a bag with a bunch of genes. But they rescued Darwin, but not the organism. It's Waddington who rescued the organism. Waddington rescues Darwin and the organism because Wadd he really pushed developmental genetics more than almost anybody with his idea of creodes and basic. He didn't know the word dynamical attractors at the time, but he has the idea of developmental landscapes, the epigenetic landscape, and that metaphor is dominant now. And what my Boolean nets did with their attractors, the attractors became the different cell types, and the transitions among them became the models of differentiation. That's another dominant view of biology. Well, in this area of biology, let's take it 50 years. Wadd was right. It's just wonderful.
Stuart, what do you regard as your most significant contribution? Because you've been working across so many different areas. Be an interesting question to address.
I do have something, David, that I think is my most important contribution. It was published a few months ago with my friend Andrea Rolli. The title is A Third Transition in Science. It's published in the Journal of the Royal Society Interface, April 14th, 2023. And we think it's huge. I'll tell you rapidly what we think we've done, then go into it. We think we have proven, demonstrated, we can use no mathematics based on set theory, namely all of mathematics is based on set theory. David, we can use none of it to deduce the adaptations that will arise in evolution. So if we are right, it's huge. Please have people go read it. Maybe we're wrong. if we're not wrong, it's the end of the view of the world as a machine. That view started in the year 1299. So I'm going to show you something. This is quite remarkable. I gave this talk. Well, I'm preparing to give the talk. Can you see this?
I can, yes.
Yeah, so I'll just sort of show it to you. You've got it. So I'm just going to move slowly. Can you see
So
the whole thing?
1299, what happened then?
Well, it was Christmas. I'm going to put it down and I'll come back to it. I'm beginning to understand what happened, David. The background is the following. Andrea Rowley and I have now published this paper, A Third Transition in Science. And to say it again, David, so it's in the Journal of the Royal Society Interface on the 14th of April, a few months ago. What we have shown, I'm going to say it again, it's huge if we're right. It's really huge. So your listeners should go get the paper and see if we're wrong. And if we're right, then what? What we claim to have demonstrated, and we think we have, is that we can't use any mathematics. It's based on set theory, which is all mathematics. We cannot deduce the future evolution of the biosphere. Let me say it again. We can't use mathematics to deduce the new adaptations that will arise. We can't. So pause there. In physics, getting from Newton to quantum mechanics involved the uncertainty relationship. And that demanded giving up all of classical physics because of the uncertainty relationship. What's it going to mean if we can't use any mathematics to deduce the future of the biosphere? If it's correct, it's got to be huge. And what it is, it's the end of the view of the world as a machine or a clockwork. So that takes us back to clocks. So I've had so much interest and awe and wonder, by the way, in the deepest sense. If one goes back to, for example, the year 1200 and the Andalusian civilization in the south of Spain and the north of Africa, where Christians, Muslims, and Jews commingle for 200 years, what were people thinking about in the year 1200 before science emerged? Well, the algebra was in good shape in Africa, and Maimonides and other scholars were doing things. They were, what were the problems that people were concerned with? It had to do with life and meaning and soul, and people were reinterpreting Aristotle. And people lived with the seasons and the sun and the tide. The hours were longer in the summer and shorter in the winter. And people were, in a sense, involved and embedded in nature in the way that we had been, for 300,000 years. Then, in fact, and it's very interesting reading about the implications of clocks coming. I'm assuming you can still hear me. So the first clocks were really made in around 1299, mechanical clocks, not sundials, to call monks to prayer. Look at the unintended consequences. They're always there. Over the next century, every town had a clock tower, and there's these amazing devices with arms going around and hands going around and cuckoos coming out and chimes going off and bells ringing. And people, just imagine you're in that world in 1210 or 1270. There's clockworks. Meanwhile, there's horses, and you're doing the farming with horses and plows. And the most modern thing around are these machines. So by the middle of the 1300s, clocks are all over the place. And by the time we're getting into the, for the 1400s, clocks are clocks. And for 200 or 300 years, I think the question began to arise, somehow is the world a machine? half articulated. If you're going to be modern, the world's a machine with contact forces, moving levers around. Now we get to 1543 and Blessed Copernicus. And what does Copernicus do? He has 7 postulates for which he has no independent evidence. And he writes to the Pope and says, look, please don't get too annoyed at me. That, for example, the Earth can rotate on its axis, and the Earth can have a tilted axis, and the Earth can go around the sun. And maybe the retrograde motions of the outer planets is not because they're moving. We're seeing them funny as we go around. It's really interesting. David, he has no proof for any one of his postulates alone. You put them all together, and the world snaps into view in a new way. Right?
I like that expression, snaps into view in a new way.
Well, because he saw the world differently. He didn't see the sun as going around the Earth on Mercury's chariot. He saw the Earth revolving and the sun standing still. As Wittgenstein once said, what does it mean to look one way or the other? It's the same visual image. So he saw the world a new way. And as soon as that happened, and the sun's at the center, you have to wonder, is there something coming out from the sun, maybe rays that are holding the planets in their orbits? What's going on? And then you get Kepler saying, all right, let's work it out. Oh, they're ellipses. And then you get Galileo watching pendulum swinging. And in 1687, you get Newton. Magnificent Newton. So watch what has happened. With Newton, the world is a clockwork. Absolutely, right? And on the way to Newton, we have Galileo. And from the point of view of the church, this is no little thing. It's huge, David. And we think the Inquisition was so bad for being really worried about Galileo. They weren't wrong. For 1,000 years, for more than 1,000 years, going back to the Greeks and antiquity, for Aristotle, there's the heavenly spheres for Greek science, and it's there in St. Augustine, and it's the cosmology of the church, where the Earth is the center of everything, and there's the moon up there. Then there's the sun going around the Earth on the chariot, and there's the fixed stars, and way out there on the outest realm is God. Then coming in a little closer, there's the angels and the archangel, then the outer spheres and the inner spheres, then Earth and man upon it, and women occasionally, and some animals, and then down there in the center are the 7 spheres of hell, Dante's Inferno, and it's all organized. We are the center of creation. We're made in God's image, and the church finds the value for all of society. For all of society, our meaning is in our connection to God, being the center of creation, and it really was. And the world wasn't a machine. It was the cows coming in. So when Galileo says, look, there's these moons orbiting around Jupiter, and that helps, cement in the Copernican worldview. If the Earth is rolling around the sun, we are not the center of the universe. We can't imagine how politically incorrect it was. It was monumental. The meaning of the world was shifting out from under people. What are we to do? That started the abrupt battle between science and religion. It started a bit before Galileo. Galileo says, "E por se muove," meaning the Earth, nevertheless it moves.
It moves, yes.
"E por se muove." And he's our hero because he withstood the stupid church. Well, was the church so stupid? They knew it's going to change the moral structure of the world, and it did. Meanwhile, they were selling indulgences and making a bunch of money for it in 1500. And so the Protestant Reformation comes along. So now we've got Newton. What's Newton? David, it's the Newtonian paradigm. I'm going to tell you to you explicitly. I've learned it from others, but here it is. Identify the relevant variables. That's position of momentum. Write some laws in differential form, coupling the relevant variables. Newton's 3 laws of motion and universal gravitation. Critical next step, state boundary conditions. So think of the billiard table. The boundary conditions define all possible combinations of positions and momentum of the balls on the table, right? That set of all possible combinations of the relevant variables is the phase space of the system. And in Newton, you always have to specify the phase space ahead of time. And it can't change. You got to know it. And the reason you have to know it is you then specify the initial conditions. And then you integrate Newton's equations. Well, to integrate is to deduce the consequences of the equations. And what you get is an entailed trajectory of the balls in their phase space. That's the clockwork. And the integration is the entailed trajectory. That's Newton. And that's the Newtonian paradigm. And centuries later, with the invention of quantum mechanics 100 years ago, still in the Newtonian paradigm of a pre-stated phase space and Schrodinger's equation. And what you get is the entailed evolution of a probability distribution, and then the wackiness of what happens upon actualization. We have lived in the clockwork of a pre-stated space of possibilities from Copernicus to Newton to quantum mechanics. We've lived in a clockwork universe, growing suspicion that, my God, it's true with Newton for 700 years. Isn't that astonishing?
Amazing. And this is the significance of your paper that
yeah. So I'm really going to get to them. So imagine being alive in 1400 and looking at the miracle of these machines that are appearing on clocks and the modernity of it. And it was. Okay, so what we have done is said, no, the evolving biosphere, you cannot deduce the evolution of the biosphere. We've said more. Living organisms are autocatalytic sets of molecules. For example, I invented the theory, but it's true. There's autocatalytic sets of peptides. And Joanna Xavier has shown there's small molecule autocatalytic sets in all prokaryotes. Autocatalytic sets, I have to define the notion of a Kantian whole. This is Kant. He said an organized being has the property that the parts exist for and by means of the whole. So you're a Kantian whole, David. You exist because of your liver and your kidney and your spleen, but they exist because of you, right?
No, I like that.
Rocks are not Kantian wholes. It's a profound idea. All living things are Kantian wholes. A small molecule autocatalytic set is a Kantian whole. No molecule catalyzes its own formation. Each molecule gets to exist because it's part of a set that collectively catalyzes its formation. Okay? So all living things are Kantian wholes. They're collectively autocatalytic. I'm going to pause and tell you something else about them that's just stunning. And it finally got articulated in 2015. I got part of the way. The people who got there were Mael Monteville, Matteo Mosio in 2015. So this is really marvelous. So in my third book, Investigations, I was trying to figure out what's a work cycle. So what's work? Well, it's force acting through a distance. Then a guy named Atkin comes along on the second law. Says, no, work's much more interesting. It is the release of energy into a few degrees of freedom. So what does that mean? So I was able to understand it. It's a cannon and some powder at the base of the cannon and the cannonball. The cannon is the constraint. It's a boundary condition. And because the cannon's shaped like the cannon, when the powder explodes, you don't get a spherical wave. the powder's got to explode and go out. The only thing that's left for it, the only remaining possibilities, the free degrees of freedom, the few free degrees of freedom, blasts the cannonball out and does thermodynamic work. So, okay, no constraints on the release of energy, no work. Got it. So, the physicists put those in mathematically. But I'm a doctor, right? So I thought I was around at the Big Bang, early in medical training. David, there weren't any cannons. There really weren't. Where did the cannon come from? Newton leaves free where the boundary conditions come from, right? Well, it took work to make the cannon. Oh, no constraints, no work. It takes work to make the constraints. Now what? And I kind of got stuck there, realizing that work could make constraints, and I didn't see the answer. I'm going to tell you the answer. This is one of the most wonderful things you'll ever hear. So Mael Monteville and Matteo Mose wrote a paper in 2015 on constraint closure. So here's the idea. I'm going to get some work, so I need some non-equilibrium processes. Let there be 3, 1, 2, and 3. I better have some constraints. Okay, A, B, and C. A, just pause and hear it. A constrains the release of energy in process 1, and that makes a B. B constrains the release of energy in process 2, and that makes a C. C constrains the release of energy in process 3, and that makes an A. This is a system with the magical feature that there are 3 constraints, having the property that the 3 constraints constrain the release of energy that does the work that constructs the same 3 constraints.
Brilliant.
The system builds its own boundary conditions, right? The constraints are boundary conditions. The cannon's a boundary condition. Isn't that amazing? So that's constraint closure. We make automobiles. They're full of constraints on the release of energy. The automobile doesn't build itself. Cells build themselves, David. A peptide autocatalytic set, Gonan Ashkenazi has one in the Ben Gurion. There's 9 peptides. I'm going to go slowly and explicitly. It's collectively autocatalytic. It's a Kantian whole. There's 9 peptides. Each one catalyzes the formation of a second copy of the next one around a cycle. And more explicitly, peptide 1, Gonan feeds in half fragments of each of the 9 peptides from the outside. So it's a non-equilibrium chemical reaction system. Peptide 1 binds the 2 fragments of the second copy of peptide 2 and holds them in place. So it's acting as an enzyme. So it lowers the activation barrier for the reactions because the 2 things aren't floating around. And then work is done to build a peptide bond. An ATP is used in this case. So work is done. So peptide 1 making peptide 2 is the constrained release of energy into a few degrees of freedom. But peptide 2 does it for 3 and 3 for 4, blah, blah, and 9 does it for 1. So the autocatalytic peptide set that Gonan has achieves constraint closure. So it's a Kantian whole. It achieves collective autocatalysis and it achieves constraint closure. So does the small molecule autocatalytic set that Joanne's finding in all prokaryotes. She hasn't shown that they work outside of cells. So I'm now going to tell you something that I just find amazing. I think I just told you what the vital force is. This is a la vitale. It's completely non-mysterious. It's an organization of process and matter, so the processes build the constraints on the release of energy that build the constraints. So it's a non-equilibrium chemical, and every living thing is that. Even viruses are. When the virus gets inside of a cell, it's a Kantian whole, and it uses a bunch of stuff from inside the cell to construct itself, right?
Yes, I mean, it's a whole new way of thinking, isn't it? And
Yeah.
I can you cannot reduce that to any
Oh.
kind of mechanism or mathematics.
Well, yeah, and it's non-mysterious. What's wonderful is it really is. There's this wonderful poem of Dylan Thomas's, "The force that through the green fuse drives the flower." That's it. It's thrilling. It's just thrilling. So now I'm going to tell you why we can't predict what happens. Okay? So I got to tell you what an affordance is. Gibson talks about affordances. A horizontal surface affords you a place to sit. I got it. You know about Darwinian pre-adaptations, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you know, the scales of some dinosaurs that were for thermal regulation got co-opted for flag feathers, or the transparent lens crystallins evolved from perfectly normally colored enzymes. And my favorite one is the swim bladder. We can come. I'll just tell you the swim bladder. No, I won't. Anyway, the basic idea. So I'm going to talk about the uses of things. Uses of things become functions. Oh, the function of a peptide in Gonen's set is that subset of its causal features that sustains the whole. The function of your heart's to pump blood, not make heart sounds. So we can define function once we've got the idea of a Kantian whole, which is going to be critical. And it's critical that it's a subset of the causal properties. It's your heart pumping blood, not making heart sounds. So hold that. So I'm going to shift to the uses of things. So I'm going to talk about something that's really technical. Think of an engine block. You know this thing? What can you do with an engine block? Well, you can drill 8 holes in it and make an engine. But Andrea Rolli, my colleague, is Italian. He says you can drill 8 holes and store wine. Okay. Then I knew an engine block is rigid. You can use it as a chassis for a tractor, which is how tractors were made. Then Andrea and I made 2 leaps. I'm very proud of this. The engine block is a pretty good paperweight, right?
Mm-hmm.
About a year ago, I realized the corners are sharper. They can be used to crack open coconuts. You can see why I'm proud. And it's fun, right? So now I'm going to ask you the critical question, David. If you're using the engine block as a paperweight, can you deduce, oh, I can use this thing to crack open coconuts? Well, of course you can't. This thing might be a banana peel, right? That means something fundamental. You cannot deduce the different uses of something. You can't. But that's what happens.
No, they're open.
They're open.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that brings you back to the paper, which is where we
Yes.
started the conversation.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to say just by way of conclusion on this question?
Well, I'd like to give you one more example and then nail it, okay? It's the same thing for screwdrivers. And I want to get to the following. You cannot list all the uses of a screwdriver. And you cannot list all the uses of an engine block. So here's the proof. The first axiom of set theory says 2 sets are identical if and only if they have the same members. But I cannot prove that the uses of a screwdriver are identical to the uses of an engine block. So I can't get the first axiom of set theory. So I don't have set theory, and I can't get the axiom of choice. So I can't get numbers. We need the number 1 is the set of all sets that have a single element. That's a set of all things that have a single use. Bullshit. Okay? We really can't get numbers. So we can't get addition or subtraction or equations or vector spaces. So it's huge if we're right. Go read it. So to pull it together, life emerges. It becomes this Kantian whole with constraint closure. And then Andrea and I have demonstrated that once life emerges, I think there's I haven't told you that part, but this autocatalytic sets arises a phase transition to be expected in sufficiently complicated chemical soups. If that's right, Life is a natural expression of the universe. And once it's there, it just goes past the Newtonian paradigm because it keeps constructing new phase spaces that can't be deduced. That's magical.
It is indeed. And thank you very much for explaining that. I'd like just to ask you a couple of other questions. And the first is how you see the relationship between science and spirituality, or science and the sacred, developing over the next 10 or 20 years.
This paper has just gotten published, David. We think we're right. So live with me. I'm going to ask you, let's make this a dialogue. As we begin to understand that the evolving biosphere is constructing itself because it's finding new uses for things that we cannot say ahead of time. We can't say ahead of time what the biosphere is going to go and become.
So it's inherently creative, as Prigogine and Brian Swim would also argue.
Well, it's way beyond Prigogine. Prigogine just has dissipative structures, which is great.
Okay.
This is because any physical thing can get used for indefinitely many functions. It's not just physical things. The biosphere is unendingly open because it's entirely non-algorithmic. And it's creating itself because what gets to exist is what makes it in the world. It's the end of reductionism. The evolving biosphere cannot be reduced to physics. It means there's no theory of everything that the physicists want if the physicists want to deduce the evolution of a biosphere. So what does this mean for us as we begin to live with this knowledge? I think it means that we are profoundly of nature, not above nature. The doctrine of dominion is God created the earth for Adam to have dominion over. Well, you can't have dominion over something that's an ongoing creation. It's not.
No, it's a contradiction in terms.
Yeah. And I think that's going to be profoundly spiritual. We will come to understand it. We will come to understand something we knew in the 12th century. We really are of nature, not above it. We are of nature, not above it, with the emergence of the machine. And the whole world is a machine from which we are estranged, and we do nothing about it. It's just the machine out there. Well, the evolving biosphere has us in it and has crickets and wasps and the fish in the tide, and we are co-creating it with one another. And people sort of knew that in the 12th century and worried about it in Medina, in Marrakesh. That's what physicians and philosophers and poets were thinking about then. We've lost our poets, right? Because they're not serious. They're not doing science. But they're singing the becoming of the biosphere. So there's enormous spirituality in this. We haven't even gotten to mind, which is there also, but we haven't gotten to it. We haven't even gotten to the possibility of cosmic mind. Maybe I'll end on that. Sudeep Patra and I are writing a paper. The odd title is Mind Outside of Space-Time? David, it's scientific. I'll just give it to you. In quantum mechanics, there's an upper limit on non-locality. I'm sure you know non-locality. You hear me? He got frozen again, but I guess he can record me. And it's called the Cyrillson bound.
Yes.
So there's something called the Cyrillson bound. It's the upper limit on correlations from non-locality. There's data that human cognition surpasses the Cyrillson bound. It's not that strong. It's 1 in 1,000. Sudeep and I argue you can only make sense of that as mind if mind is not in space-time. Cyrillson bound depends upon special relativity and a speed limit. But that depends upon space-time. So I got to go. I got to be on another call now. But that's online too. I think there's a possibility of cosmic mind. And the quantum vacuum may be possibilities.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, David. Let's stay back in touch.
Yes, absolutely. Okay.